I'm your speaker today, as I mentioned. So, we're going to be focused on grain production today. Um, we have very little grain production in Vermont, if any, to be honest, and around the Northeast there is some. We will be hearing from a local grain farmer towards the end of the class, so that'll be exciting to get that perspective. My colleagues and I around the country actually have been conducting a lot of research in grain and trying to increase the amount of information that's available to farmers to be able to successfully grow hemp for grain production. And here's a photo right here on the front of our grain plots. This is actually from the very first year that we grew hemp at UVM. I think it was 2016 or 15. And I have to say, it was beginner's luck. I think that's what actually kept us working on hemp. How many people have ever had beginner's luck and it made you try it again for a second time and then sort of reality hits in? But we had really like the most phenomenal crop the first year that we grew hemp. And you can see how beautiful it is here. And you can see a couple of weeds out there, but not much. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, yeah, this is exactly, what people say about hemp. You don't need any herbicides, there's no weeds. It wasn't actually that hard to harvest the first year, and there weren't really any pests, and it just grew beautifully. So it made us really excited for the second year, and then we ran into a whole host of problems, which I'll talk about. So just to point out a couple of things in this photo, you can see here's the female hemp plant, and then these kind of scraggly looking plants here. These are the males. So you can really get a sense of how different they look out in the field if you haven't seen a grain crop growing with males. Or a fiber crop, and these are obviously past pollination period. They have pretty much died back at this point, and usually by the end of the season, when you're getting close to harvest, you barely notice them at all. You can also see in this photo the real difference between some of these varieties. So this was a variety trial, and if you look to the left of the slide and to the right, you can see really height differences amongst these varieties too. All right, so again, we're looking at different market classes here, and today, focused on grain. We've talked a lot about essential oils, and next week we're going to talk about fiber production with Jennifer um, Gilbert from SUNY Morrisville. So that'll be exciting as well. And kind of wrapping up the class, talking about processing and focusing on these three classes as well. So, I showed this, I think, in the first week, and people have talked about this throughout the class that there's all these uses for hemp. And really, most of what's happening out there has really been focused on sort of the essential oils, the CBD, CBG, maybe some of the terpenes, and a lot less effort focused on everything else, which is quite significant. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And if you look over here in this corner where you see seeds as a product, you can see all the various end uses for the seeds and the oil that's extracted from them, or the seed cake that's left. So when you think about hemp grain, and again, we're going to have a whole webinar on this, it is an oil seed. And when we're talking about oils in this context, we're talking about oil that would be really similar to something like flax seed oil or canola oil. And so it's extruded out of the seed. And this oil is very, very different than the CBG essential oil, CBD, that we're talking about that get actually processed out of the unfertilized female flower. I just wanted to quickly talk about this. I don't, really think we have spent or will spend much time on this in this class, but this this year in 2020 was the first year where there was a pilot federal crop insurance program for hemp. And I haven't heard much about it. And maybe at the end, Stephanie, maybe you know more about what's happening with this. There were a number of what we would call pilot states that were enabled to enroll crops. You can see Vermont was not one of them, or actually any state in New England. Oh, actually, Maine was. I wonder how you guys got on the list. So maybe John, you know something about this as well. But there was a pilot program, and of course, the goal is to continue to roll out crop insurance programs for hemp over time. So it'll be interesting to see where crop insurance heads for these crops in the near future. All right, just to revisit quickly with grain, we actually are planting female and male plants, and you can clearly see the differences. I've already shown it once. And the male plants are, they're kind of straggly. They grow a little bit taller than the females, and then they shed pollen. They start to shed pollen relatively early, actually. And the pollen itself, a lot of it does just sort of fall within the sort of vicinity of the plant, but it's set up for wind dispersal primarily. And I'm sure most people have heard about pollination issues, pollen drift. And this is a huge concern in many states where we do have these different market classes being grown or considering to be grown, meaning that we may have hemp being grown for a CBD market where we only want female plants. We definitely don't want male plants. And then you have a grain farmer that needs those male plants to produce grain. So these competing products, interests, it's going to continue to arise, especially as the number of acres in grain and fiber um, increases over time. So this is going to be something that we all need to deal with and figure out, um, you know, what you know what standards states and even the country is going to set. Now, of course, it's not unheard of for places around this country and other places around the world to have those same kind of, I want to say, competing interests. So a really good example is in beets, sugar beets and table beets. Out in the West, places like Oregon, they have set up strategies to basically help with isolation of crops to be able to successfully grow both in the same state. So there are ways to achieve this, but definitely difficult decisions often that have to be made. So some states have already developed some isolation distances for seed production, and also in the case of states where they're producing marijuana, recreational marijuana versus industrial hemp. So here's just a couple of examples of isolation distances created or established in certain states. And again, as far as I know, I'm not sure if we have anything set in Vermont, but I'm sure we can talk about that after the presentation. When you're growing grain, it is industrial hemp. It's hemp. It's the same plant as the hemp that gets grown for recreational purposes, or the plant that gets grown to extract CBD. They are really genetically, or not genetically, they are botanically the same plant. But grain varieties and fiber varieties have generally been selected for over time to have very low concentrations of THC and other cannabinoids. They are still present, of course, but generally in very low levels. And because you're bringing the plant to maturity for grain, the concentrations in the female flower itself are obviously very low upon harvest. In some places, in some countries, the leaves and stems are still harvested, and the CBD is extracted from those parts of the plants, while the grain is used and goes into other channels as well. But generally, for the grain varieties that are being grown and fiber varieties, the cannabinoids tend to be very low. It is interesting. There certainly is a lot of interest from seed companies that already have these varieties to know what is the concentration of CBD. Is there a potential for dual purpose varieties that are, harvested by farmers for grain, but then also may have decent levels of CBD as well? And I will say we have looked at a few of those. We have seen CBD concentrations in a couple of varieties, fiber specific varieties that were about 4% CBD. So there is a lot of interest in growing that dual purpose market. So we looked at this picture early on. Here's an unfertilized female hemp flower or inflorescence, I should say. And then to the right here is a fertilized inflorescence. And if you look closely, you can see the seeds are forming here on the plant, and they're kind of wrapped in these beautiful green calyx that protects the seed until it's very mature. And then you can see in here some browning, and the calyx is starting to brown. They do eventually kind of drop off, and then the seed is exposed. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the time to harvest, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. And then here's a photo of the grain up close. And again, you can see the seeds here that still have that calyx around them. And when you harvest, you generally get quite a bit of seed that is mature. You can kind of see right here. I don't know if you can actually see my pointer, but you can see the green calyx, and under it, you can see a mature seed. So when you're harvesting, you're actually going to have seed mixed with all this green material. And, if you're an agronomist on the presentation right now, you're immediately probably thinking like, yikes, yeah, that's going to be wet. And the chance of it molding is going to be really high, which is absolutely true. And again, we'll talk about that when we get to harvesting. Um, so during the processing presentation, I'm sure Jeff, who will be giving that presentation, will talk about extruding the oil from the seed and what that entails and how it's done. But we have done this in our research program. We were set up with oil seed presses from many different projects that we've worked on over the past decade or so, sunflowers, canola, and now we're using our oil presses to extrude the oil from the hemp seed as well. So again, the hemp seed oil is considered very healthy, and there's lots of potential end uses for it. Um, so, you know, I think Jennifer's going to touch on this next week, but definitely a lot of interest in how we take hemp, grow it on farms, and be able to utilize the plant for the same field, plants in the field for different purposes. And again, as the industry grows and expands and develops, this is where much of research and breeding programs are really interested in how do we take this one crop in a field, this one plant, and use it for, seed and fiber, or fiber and essential oils, etc. So here's just a picture of hemp being harvested, and not in our country, but both, you can see the green material being harvested off the top. This is, might be going for animal feed. This could be going for CBD extraction, and then the fiber being laid down below to be picked up and used in other fiber products. So a lot of exciting opportunities here. So, very similar to what we talked about for growing hemp for CBD. When you're growing for grain, you really want to have well-drained soils. Hemp does not like waterlogged soils. It likes full sun. And again, it's relatively tolerant to hot, dry conditions, as long as the roots can reach some water. So it does have a very deep rooting system. Again, But you need to have good soils for the plant to basically be able to grow and explore to get nutrients, water, especially as they become limited. But what the plant cannot stand are waterlogged soils. Water usage, again, we already talked about this, really um, ideally requiring 20 to 30 inches of precipitation during the growing period. Of course, there's actually not a lot of good literature on this, and we also know that hemp, again, can be grown in arid regions without irrigation. So it's really the ability of this plant to set really deep roots and to scavenge water and nutrients when it's put under drought stress. All right, so here's a picture of hemp being grown for grain. Just so you can see right from the get-go how closely these plants are planted together directly into the soil. This was a really wet field, and you can see the hemp is suffering. It's already chlorotic. You can already see necrosis of the plants. Just a really difficult situation. When hemp gets off to a poor start as a seedling, it will pay for it for the rest of the season. I guess it's like anything else, right? We really need to take care of our babies. They're the future, and that's not any different for plants. So getting that hemp out of the ground in soil conditions that are optimum or near optimum is going to lead to the highest grain yields in the field. All right, so again, I already said really too much, you know, clay's fine, just you got to have those soils draining. You don't need waterlogged soils. It's not going to do you any good. Um, and then the pH again needs to be relatively high, definitely over 6. And it is a crop that is what we would consider nutrient loving. And I know that goes against what other I've read actually myself in some publications, but you know, hemp likes ample amounts of nitrogen, a decent amount of phosphorus, and a good amount of potassium, and it actually has requirements between a small grain and corn. So it kind of falls in between that. It can be more efficient at nutrient uptake, as I've already mentioned, than some of our other agronomic crops. But again, in order to to have that efficiency, you have to set up that crop to be able to explore the soil and maximize its root system. So fertility requirements, again, the whole plant biomass is about 2.5 to 3% potassium. So on average, really depending on your soil test, folks, and background fertility, this may mean, that your crop on average might need 60 to 70 pounds of potassium. It's only about 0.5% phosphorus, so its phosphorus requirements are lower. But again, if you have a low soil test level, you could need 50 to 70 pounds of phosphorus. And then nitrogen, again, it's I say 5 to 6% here, but new numbers that we're bringing in with current research is showing anywhere between 3 and 5%, probably more realistically. But again, this is 100 up to 200 pounds of nitrogen, so it falls right, kind of in the range of what corn needs as well. But I will say that, Willie brought this up last week during the presentations, that if you have really rich soils that have been manured and have high organic matter, the amount of fertility that you're going to need to grow hemp is going to be minimal. But that's, pretty similar to other crops too. So soil testing is really important. John talked about this last week as well, to really figure out where you're at. And then we can start talking about what that crop's going to need to grow. But it does need nutrients. Here's some research from grain hemp. So we've done the same thing in essential oil hemp or CBD hemp, whatever you want to call it. And the results are very similar. So you can see here that we get a crop response with between 100 and 150 pounds of nitrogen applied per acre. If we're below 100 pounds, and again, this was 1 year, one soil scenario. If we applied below 100 pounds, we saw less yields. So it does seem, based on my data and other folks' data that's starting to come in from around the country, that this is the range that we're looking at. Again, you may not need to add any nitrogen to your field depending on the background fertility. Okay, so this is really looking at crop uptake, right? So, what that crop's going to take out of the ground. If you have 125 pounds of nitrogen available for your crop in the soil already, you likely don't need to add anything else. So that's what we're trying to figure out. What is that crop going to remove from the soil? So varieties. And again, the varieties that we grow for grain and fiber are really, they look different. They obviously are planted differently and they grow different than those that are being grown for CBD end use. So Vermont this year for the first year was a part of the multi-state variety trial for fiber and grain. This is actually a picture from that trial in Pennsylvania. So we're working with many states across the country, across many different environments and soil types to see what varieties that are currently available, and there's not that many, are going to do the best in our different, zones, regions, climates, environments. These evaluations, these trials have been going on for a few years, and we've been evaluating varieties for a number of years, but this was the first year we participated in the multi-state trial. These were the varieties included this year, and we actually had a few more on top of this that we have interest in. Actually, this is from 2019. There's a couple additional varieties, and maybe I'll highlight those. Some U.S. varieties that have been produced through U.S. breeding programs. Those are coming out of a company called New West, Nuwest. And I will say they performed very well in our trials. It was the first time we had ever evaluated them, and I was really impressed. I've been impressed with some of these varieties as well, but it was good to see something coming out of the U.S. And I want to say that seemed to fit for our climate as well. So we are trialing a number of different varieties. Here's some of our yield data over average yield data for the variety trials over the last number of years. We do have 2020's data. I believe it's been posted on our website now, so you can go and check that out. But basically, in most years, we're hovering right about 1,000-pound yield average. You can see 2017. Remember, I said 2016 was beginner's luck, and then 2017 reality hit home. We went from 1,000-pound average from all the varieties down to half of that. So it was sort of this wake up call that, okay, this is not as easy as we thought it would be. But overall, as we're starting to understand better how to grow the crop and its peculiarities, there we go, I got that one out. I would say, honestly, I still struggle with it. But I do know that we can achieve, at least a ton or more yields. We have. Again, these are average across all the varieties. So we do have, you know, we have seen much higher yields, but this is the average and probably realistic number to work with for folks that are just getting started. So here's a number of varieties. This is from 2019 from our trials, I believe. And you can see the yield range here going from a little under 600 pounds up to over 1,200 pounds with some of the varieties that we've been looking at. One of the things you'll notice is that there's not a lot of split in the what we call the significant differences. So that means that if a variety has the letter A, they performed statistically similar. So this essentially says that this variety pheromone that yielded about 1,250 pounds wasn't any different statistically than Joey that yielded 800 pounds roughly. Now, as a farmer, you would say, well, there's that 400-pound difference is a big yield difference. But what this really shows is how much variability is in these numbers. And I probably should have the error bar here, but I don't. So there is a lot of variation in the data. It's a crop that I will say it shows its true colors when it's angry. I know I've said this in other presentations. When it's angry and upset with you, it lets you know. And it's been fascinating to me to have plots. I mean, these are little plots, right? They're 5 by 20, and to have you know that much variation in a variety trial it's just it's fascinating. Usually there's not as that much variation. So it just really shows you again, there's some particular things that need to be in place, and I will really advocate for people watching their pH. That is something that shocked me here with our little plots. We were in a field, um, was it this year? I can't quite remember, but I just could not figure out what was going on. And there was one part of the field that looked great, and like a couple of plots in the middle that looked awful. And I went out and soil sampled every single plot. Normally, we sort of take a general soil sample for that area, which is, it's not even a quarter acre. Um, and just like some pretty, slight differences, I think, in fertility seem to be uh, really impacting the varieties. So again, um, if you get everything right, it grows like gangbusters. One thing I want to mention is that when you're selecting varieties, there are what are termed like grain specific varieties. So their purpose is for grain. And then there's fiber varieties, and then there's dual purpose varieties. So grain varieties tend to be very short, like um, barley. Actually, they're very short, and a lot of the times they barely make it over my knees. So similar to some of the small grain varieties that have been bred to be much shorter and easier to handle with a combine. And then you have sort of dual purpose varieties and fiber varieties, and they tend to be much taller for the most part, um, because you're going to harvest the stems and the seed. So personally, this is something I think people need to be aware of, because this variety, Catani and Grande, they have performed poorly in our trials year in and year out. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they can't seem to compete with the weeds as well as the taller varieties, right? It makes sense. They don't shade as much, they're not as leafy, they're not as tall. And we have some real weed issues here. And it also they tend to get more head diseases. We see more fusarium on them, and white mold. And again, I think it's because of the weed pressure around them, but just something to really be aware of. I don't think these fit that well in our region, where we can get a lot of late season weeds. They really can't compete as well. All right. So planting date, let's talk about planting date. So we, started a lot of our research looking at basic agronomics, and continue to do so. So, you look at what varieties are best suited for the area and when should we plant this? How early and how late really are the questions that we try to answer. what's the implications of going either direction. You want to know you have a window as a farmer, right? Yeah, well, I know I can plant as early as this, and I better not go later than that because I won't get any yields or whatever might happen. So here was our first year that we did the or the planting date study, and you can see we had the best yields when we planted on the 26th of May, and we had horrible yields anytime after that. And that was interesting to me. So I thought, okay, well, maybe we should plant earlier actually, instead of later, and get the crop in the ground earlier. Part of the reason we had, weren't able to do that in the first year is because it was very difficult to get seed early on. Okay, so the next year we started a little bit earlier, and got done a little bit earlier as well. We went to the middle of June, and that year you can see grain yields were horrible, but nonetheless they were worse with that kind of third week of May planting date, and they actually got better the later we went. So here's some data from Penn State. Greg Roth, who's retired at this point, and Alyssa Collins is taking over that research. They, basically saw that planting in early June versus late June gave them some yield advantage. Okay, so what is it? What do we do? And what I have learned over time, and I still don't quite I still haven't nailed it yet, but I feel like I'm getting close, is that it has, there certainly is a window, right? We all know that. You want the ground to be relatively warm. So, all of this seed is untreated at this point. So remember that. So you want the ground to be warm enough that the seed isn't completely predisposed to, being attacked by pathogens and not able to germinate quickly. So let's start with that. So for many of us, or who knows, I mean, you folks are from all over the place. Basically, you probably want the soil to be around 55 degrees. Out in Canada, they're planting really early. Montana too. I've seen some data from them saying they're planting in the first part of May. So, and then how late can we go? And this is a photo period sensitive crop. So you can imagine the later you go, the less time you have for plant vegetative development, and really kind of seed development too, right? So, um, and then to add to that, what I've heard from farmers in Canada is that you just need to be patient, and that you need to have soil that has decent moisture, and you need to know that you're not going to get a terrible rainstorm just following planting. Okay, get out the crystal ball, right? But the point really being is, don't rush to get it in. Really try to wait until the conditions are the most conducive with this crop, because if you don't, you're going to pay dearly in yields, regardless of if you're planting in the middle of June or the middle of May. In either direction, you could fail miserably or have excellent yields. And I'm going to talk about a little more about this. All right. Seeding rate. Now for grain, it depends who you ask, and what data you use, but farmers in Canada seed anywhere between 15 and 30 pounds of seed per acre. Okay, so here again was some data collected by Greg Roth, and he kind of found the sweet spot to be around 30 pounds, okay, per acre. And a lot goes into making this decision, and I'm now going to talk about that because I don't think it's that clear cut. All right, so planting date. May through mid-June is ideal. I mean, you can go later than mid-June, and we have done that and have gotten respectable yields, but I think you really want to get it in by the middle of June. When you plant in May, I think you really need to be looking at those soil conditions very carefully, what the weather's going to be like on the other side of planting and the soil moisture. Seeding depth, 2 to 3 centimeters is what's recommended by the Canadians. Again, depends a little bit on moisture and temperature as well. So a 1/4 inch is what some people are advocating for, but you can plant to a depth of about an inch as well. And then again, seeding rate, the average range is 20 to 25 pounds per acre. But again, depending on the variety, the germ rate, and the soil conditions, you actually could be looking at anything from 15 pounds all the way up to 45. Okay. Okay, so planting and seed bed preparation. Planting is done with a grain drill. You know, it's a small seed. This is a band seeder. It's like a little Gandy seeder piece of equipment that we built. We've used vacuum seeders, air seeders, kind of standard grain drills. We've used just about everything, any kind of grain drill to plant hemp, and it's worked. They've all worked depending on the soil conditions. But a grain drill is what I would advocate for with that, standard 6 to 7.5 inch spacing between rows. Okay. Seed bed preparation. It is a little seed, so fine seed bed preparation is good, but I will advocate more for paying attention to the overall soil quality of the field. This is going to be critical to success. Okay. Everybody in our multi-state group, including ourselves, have had some real serious challenges with emergence. So hemp does not at all tolerate soil crusting. And so this again, uh, if you are planting into a field that has somewhat poor aggregation, soil aggregation and soil health, you're going to want to make sure that you don't get that deluge of rain afterwards that's going to cause that soil crusting. And soil crusting is really, really common in many of our fields in agriculture because you will end up with a terrible stand of hemp. And actually, no matter how high you set that seeding rate, it can still be an issue. Okay. So this is really important to your success on the other end. Here's some data we collected a few years ago. So we're only getting 40% of the seed that we put in the ground germinating in 2016. Now, with that in mind, we still were getting, decent yields here. Okay. But we were planning right at the get-go, based on what the Canadians told us, for a 30% mortality loss. So, the Canadians plan for 30% of the seed to be lost that's put in the ground after they adjust the seeding rate for the germ. All right. And then in 2017, it was even worse. We only ended up with 30% of the seed we put in the ground. Now, this obviously has huge implications on yields. And the other thing it greatly impacts is weed control. So obviously, you can see here crusted soil. You can see uneven emergence, right? You can see seeds just coming out of the ground, those that are already emerged, and they have two true leaves starting to come out. And then you have these huge gaps where obviously seed was planted, but nothing is going to emerge here. Well, let me take that back. What's going to emerge here? weeds, right? So you can have a crop that suppresses weeds and is phenomenal, like the one I showed you on the first page. Or you can have a crop that ends up like this, and it is full of weeds. Okay. And this is what most people are experiencing right now. And they are scrambling to get herbicides registered. Okay. But we also need to be really paying attention to conditions and soil health and quality. Okay. This is really key to our success. Pennsylvania has started looking at using rotary hose to break up that crust, which again, is a tool very common for organic row crop producers, not so common on conventional farms. It's a little video so you can see what it looks like there if you have never seen one operate before. Yep. So the goal here is really to break up that crust and try to get those plants out of the ground. And again, this is at Penn State, and they're trying to see if it helped at all. Now, of course, if you're planting a 1/4 inch deep, you got to be really careful about using this. And, in the whole scheme of things, it still didn't outcompete the weeds. You can see this is a different thing we'll talk about in a second, but you can see all the foxtail out here and different weeds, especially as you get over to the center of this field. Okay. So, getting the plants out of the ground, eliminating surface crusting, which is going to be super hard in this climate, is how we're going to get good stands. We're seeing seedlings damp off, which is probably another issue, I'm sure, but we're trying to account for that by increasing seeding rates. Again, there's no treatment on the seeds, which is pretty traditional in conventional agriculture for most other crops, but not at all traditional in organic production, right? Where chemical seed treatments are not allowed. We should be able to grow a great crop. We know we can actually grow a great crop without the seed treatments. But as you can probably tell with these challenges people are having, they're rushing for the chemicals right away. And anyway, maybe not the best answer. So Penn State, again, has looked a little bit about irrigating the seed up, trying to get it out of the ground as soon as possible, reducing that crusting issue as well. But this isn't feasible for most people here in the East, especially on a large scale. Okay, so they're going to seed treatments. As I said, we've actually also looked at seed treatments. There are no seed treatments, or there hadn't been any approved in Canada either. So it's same problem they have. But, people are looking to get chemical seed treatments registered. We've looked at biological treatments. Some of them have helped a little bit, and we need to continue to do that work. But here's some work from Cornell where they're treating the seed with standard treatment. So Apron and Maxim, many of you might know those names, being used to treat seed. And you can see that, it does seem to increase the percentage of plants that are merging. Still not that great though, right? So, maybe not the answer we're looking for, but it'd probably help in some cases. So again, here you go. You can see the soil crusting. You can see the plants trying to get out of the ground, terrible soil conditions. So, people are saying, well, you can plant a little more shallow, that might help. But again, rapid drying, bird predation, which I listed here, we have a horrible time with birds up at our research farm eating everything right out of the ground. So, planting a little bit deeper might help. So again, trying to reduce surface crusting is critical to good stands and high yields, and reduction in pesticides, which is what you hear everybody talking about. Here's just more data. I think I got my point across with you, but one thing I think people should really pay attention to, though, that I haven't mentioned, is the germ rate of some of this seed. Even if you get seed to you in a bag and it has a label on it, I would still do a germ test. This stuff fluctuates, it seems, quite considerably. Um, and you can see here we've got Futura here at 69% germ and others that are much higher. So, I recommend that folks do a germ test to put in um, a seeding rate that's adjusted for germ and the 30% mortality rate that I talked about. All right. So again, this is emergence data that other people are showing, and it's all over the board, as you can see. And we really we know what we need to do to address this. It's just that often dealing with Mother Nature is challenging, as everybody knows in agriculture. So there is work being started on no-till production of hemp. I know that they've done some work at Penn State, and Alyssa Collins shared this data with me. I know John Jemison is gearing up to do some work with roller crimping. And so this was actually an accident, which is always the best kind of research. Um, and you can see here, this little area here, they had burned down this wheat cover crop with a herbicide, and they burned it down to no-till plant these corn plots. But there was this little buffer here in between where they were going to plant the corn and where they were going to plant the wheat. And so they no-tilled hemp into this area. And you can see right here where they had burned down that wheat with an herbicide, how much better the hemp did in the no-till system. So this is where they didn't do that, and this is where they did. And again, you can see this little close-up picture here too. So, obviously this is an area that has not at all been really investigated. This is preliminary data, but again, more work is being done in this area. I do think if we have healthier soils with adequate moisture, you're going to get better stands. So how we create those is going to differ by farm. And you can see here the number of plants per 10 foot of row was much better in that area than even conventional tillage plots. So I think there's a lot for us to do in this area. But again, it really comes down to having those ideal soil conditions for the crop to grow. Our team has done some other weed control work with cultivation. And we only did this 1 year, and I haven't done it since. I didn't really like cultivating hemp. And in that 1 year, it didn't make a difference, and I felt like we really damaged the plants. So we planted in 9-inch rows. We planted in 18 inches between the rows. And then we did the standard 6.5, 7 inches between the hemp rows. And in the slightly wider rows, the 9-inch and the 18-inch, we did cultivate with a field cultivator. And in that year, it didn't make any difference, right? And again, it's because we had this great stand of hemp. You can see how thick that stand is right there. And once that those plants got to about knee high, there wasn't a single weed in the canopy. So I think, yeah, it's really all about getting those stands. And here's just the ground cover data from that study. So as I mentioned, other universities, this is from Virginia Tech. Alyssa Collins and I just gave a presentation, like a research roundup at a hemp conference. So many of our colleagues shared information with us, and now I'm sharing that with you. So that's why I have all this other info. And so this is coming out of Virginia Tech. And again, people are looking for herbicides in a variety of systems to control weeds in hemp. And they're looking at both pre-emergence herbicides. Here's the herbicides they're evaluating. Many of these probably look familiar to folks that work in the industry from Prowl. We have Spartan here, Warrant, Outlook, Dual 2 Magnum. So a lot of common herbicides being tested in hemp right now. They're looking at injury at this point. Is it going to injure the crop? So this is pre-emergence before the crop comes out of the ground. And then they're also looking at post-emergence herbicides. So again, many that are commonly used in our area. You have Bucktrill here, Stinger, Harmony, Select, Post, Assure. So this work again is being done. They're looking at injury levels to the hemp. You can see the ones that are not causing any injury. And, this work is being done to get them registered in hemp. So, it is coming. And, it's certainly good to have various options available. But, I really think our focus should be on, um, having that healthy soil and not having to use those tools unless we need to. But who knows what will happen. All right, let's quickly talk about harvesting, and then we'll open it up for questions. So here's us harvesting that hemp in the first year. And we were told by our Canadian partners that there is a window to harvest. And we hit the window spot on. And um, and the hemp harvested really well. You can see it's tall and gangly. And this is a little plot combine too. So we have this tiny little feeder house here. And we're lifting the head up as high as we can get it to just take the seed heads off. It's completely green, which is really different than how we harvest most every other crop for seed, right? You wait for it to be dead and brown as possible and dry as possible. And, a lot of growers that don't have the experience, that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for it to look like the males, that dead material. And if you wait, you'll never get it harvested. So the best time to harvest hemp, really it's going to be about the same time every year. It's going to be right around Labor Day or just after Labor Day. So it's going to fall within that approximate 2-week window. Because it is a photoperiod sensitive crop and it does mature relatively around the same time every year. And it is green. And when you look at the seed head, you'll see some of the brown seed exposed, but most of it is not. But when you combine it, all those calyxes, or most of them, will fall off and you'll see that brown seed underneath. So we harvested this. We were so excited. The seed was pouring out of the combine, and nobody was really saying anything because we felt like it was too good to be true. And I remember the first day, we got through, I think, the variety trial. That's what we're harvesting here, or the weed control study, actually. And we kind of got into the barn and said, wow, that wasn't as bad as we thought it would be. Well, the next time we went out, the motor on the combine went, and we ended up having to ship the motor out, and we were delayed harvesting by 2 additional weeks. Actually, I think it was almost October. And the crop looked fine. It actually didn't look a whole lot different than this, a little bit. You could see the birds. Birds are a real issue, just so folks know, preying on the seed, especially in little research plots. But when we went out to start combining, things were very, very different. Okay. When we first combined, we would pull these seed heads off. They'd go through the feeder house. It would rip the seed off of the stem, and the stem would fly out of the back of the combine. Okay. Whole. And actually, you'd have to be careful because it would like fling out and, like hit you and stab you. It was kind of dangerous. When we went out, yeah, it might have been almost 3 weeks later, this is what happened. And you can see that the plant had matured. And what I believe is probably happening is that those gums, right, that hold that sort of bass fiber to the herd had started to degrade naturally. And then when it started going through the combine, it just started to break and wrap. And yeah, I mean, this is yeah, you can see Roger very upset. It took us a lot of patience to get through this. A normal person, normal people wouldn't have done that, but we were very determined because it was our first crop, and learned to be timely. And I know a lot of other farmers that just never finished acres because of this. So it's probably one of the most important take home messages here. And then from there, you got to get it dried, right? You got to get some air on it. It doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a lot of heat or anything, but you got to get some air circulating through that seed that's really green and full. It's hard to clean it right away because it is really sticky and gummy. A rotary cleaner, one of the big rotary cleaners, would probably work pretty well to get out some of the initial green. But trying to put it through like a fanning mill or a clipper cleaner, like don't do it. It's so sticky, it just gums everything up. You're better off to get it in a grain bin or sacks or something and get aerators in it, and get those hulls or calyxes dried down and then clean it. But you got to do it right away. It starts to heat, within hours. So, all right. Well, we're running short on time. And so I'll end on that. Hopefully, that was a good intro to growing hemp for grain. And you'll hear more about processing and post harvest handling in a few weeks. So that's it.